Cell Damage was a vehicular combat game created by Pseudo Interactive and published by Electronic Arts. It first released on the Xbox in late 2001 before hitting the Nintendo GameCube in May of the following year, and later being updated for the PS2 under the title Cell Damage Overdrive. The game had its detractors, being subject to mixed reviews from critics, but over time developed a modest fan following, enough to warrant an HD re-release years later. Although the game would attain some success in the long term, there was once a time when Pseudo Interactive's plans for Cell Damage were much greater. This included a sequel. The company only officially acknowledged this project once, during a post-mortem article written for Gamasutra in 2002 by their CEO, David Wu. He mentioned that Cell Damage 2 would be one of their next projects in development and would launch in late 2003. I contacted Wu and a number of his former colleagues from Pseudo to bring to light why this never came true. Preparatory work towards Cell Damage 2 commenced in around the second quarter of 2002. This was after the first game had already arrived on Xbox and around the time of its launch on GameCube. It was to some extent a time of self-reflection for Pseudo Interactive as they looked back on its development, hence David Wu's post-mortem article. They were evaluating the finished product, picking it apart to decide what they believed worked and where there was room for improvement. This manner of self-examination is emblematic of the Cell Damage 2 project as a whole. It was the team's attempt to right the wrongs of the first game, polishing and building upon the pre-established formula to the best of their ability. They paid attention to its critical reception and feedback sourced from fans to hone in on what needed to change. The opening of their main pitch documents to publishers serves as evidence of this. Aspects that customers felt didn't work will be improved. One of their first concerns was the matter of accessibility. For a start, it was going to aim for a simultaneous launch on all major consoles at the time, Xbox, GameCube and PS2. Cell Damage 2 would have focused on welcoming newcomers to the series and being less intimidating in general. They planned on adding training missions and mini-games to give players a safe environment in which they could learn the game mechanics. The entry-level difficulty was planned to be made easier, although they still wanted to maintain the much more challenging settings for more adept players. Pseudo was also working to reduce one-hit kills and random deaths, two fairly prominent aspects of the first game that was subject to criticism. They wanted to allow players more time to plan and react, hopefully making battles fairer and more satisfying. In order to do this, they were introducing a health bar along with dynamically rendered damage effects for vehicles. Your vehicle's health was able to slowly regenerate over time too. This wouldn't have cut one-hit kills out of the equation completely, however. They would have just been reserved for the most powerful weapons. They were attempting to inject more depth and strategy into the mechanics through a few big additions like this. For the first time, players were able to exit their vehicles and proceed on foot. Generally, you wouldn't have been encouraged to do this as it would leave you vulnerable, but occasionally it might have been worth venturing out to, for instance, reach an area inaccessible of vehicles. Now when a player's vehicle was destroyed, they wouldn't simply respawn right away in another one. Instead, they would land on the ground and would either have to survive until another became available and dropped in, or hijack someone else's. They were also adding alternative firing modes, as they referred to them, to the majority of weapons. This meant they could be used in a couple of different ways as opposed to just one. Additionally, there were brand new weapon pickups, including a cloaking device and a lightning gun. There were some reasonably substantial shakeups to the core gameplay, but at the same time, they were hoping to simply make the sequel bigger, packed with more content than the first game. This meant levels were now more expansive and larger in number. They drew concepts for a few different settings over the course of development, including a post-apocalyptic sci-fi world and the inside of a volcanic cavern, to name a couple. Only one was used for the prototype build they made to pitch the game to publishers, a prehistoric landmass named Dinosaur Island. It featured a fully drivable underwater section complete with robot sharks. The character roster in Cell Damage 2 was, like everything else, receiving a bit of a shake-up. In the way of returning characters, there was Cinder, Violet, Dominique, and Foulmouth. Two of the boss characters from the original were being brought back too, and unlike before, they would have been unlocked from the start. These were Count Earl and Whack Angus. They would have been joined by 4 brand new bosses, images of which Pseudo Interactive's former heads were glad to dig up for the purposes of this video. Unfortunately, the names of these characters have become lost to time. The names that were proposed have been completely forgotten by those that worked on it and weren't preserved in any of the recovered documents. Representing the Dinosaur Islands theme was a caveman character wielding a bone club. There was a new robot character, an Egyptian princess, and a sheep king. All 3 modes from the original Cell Damage Damage, Gate Relay, Flag Rally and Smack Attack were planned to return, and this time with team variants. For example, the mode they were testing was Team Smack Attack. Players would assemble a group of 4 contestants of their choice and compete against a rival team with a shared pool of hits being counted up. We will never know how it might have turned out had it ever been made, but its early design documents offer us insight into a project that was meant to be larger in scope and heavier on ambition. It was being realised during a place in time when Pseudo Interactive had confidence in Cell Damage to become something grander, a series and a potentially valuable IP. Their partners, however, didn't view it in the same light. As the publisher of the first game, it was Electronic Arts who they first approached to help them bring the sequel to life. EA met with them, saw their prototype and came to the conclusion that they would not be investing in it for an assortment of different reasons. One of their main issues was related to sales data. At the time it was being pitched, they had yet to port the first game to PS2. Meanwhile, its performance on the 2 platforms it was available on was slow, failing to meet EA's targets. They also had reservations about the very nature of the game and its marketability. Despite efforts to switch up the visual style a bit, its cartoonish look made it a hard sell for some. According to David Wu, a cartoon-style title without a well-established property behind it from the likes of Disney or DreamWorks was a tough pill to swallow for publishers at the time. Then there was the matter of placement. As a game in the car combat subgenre, it was feared that its appeal might not extend beyond a fairly niche audience. It wasn't quite a racing game, and it wasn't quite a shooter. It existed in a midpoint viewed by some executives as too awkward and difficult for the mass market to pick up and play. Pseudo was very clearly outlining its endeavours to make Cell Damage more accessible, but Electronic Arts couldn't be swayed, and they weren't the only ones. Due to the open conditions of their partnership with EA, Pseudo Interactive was able to maintain full ownership of the Cell Damage IP, meaning they could now sell the sequel to a new publisher. After an unsuccessful first proposal, they began to pitch the project to a number of other companies, including Sega, Ubisoft, Midway and others. Ultimately, for the same reasons as Electronic Arts, Cell Damage 2 was deemed unlikely to be a viable investment by these other publishers. Eventually, Cell Damage was able to sell through the entirety of its stock over the remainder of the generation after its release on PS2. Still, this wasn't enough for the developers to revive its sequel. Without the resources to finance it themselves, Pseudo Interactive killed the project for good in 2002 and moved on to other ventures. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe and check out my other videos for exclusive looks at many more lost games just like this one. Be sure to hit the annotation to see lots more from Unseen64. I hope you found this video to be of interest, and have fun.